He sat alone at the edge of town, a solitary figure carved from stone and shadow. The Apache's weathered face told a story of battles fought and lost, not just against enemies, but against a world determined to forget him. Townspeople averted their eyes as they passed, mothers pulling children closer. His name, once spoken with respect among his people, was now only whispered with fear. 20 years of wandering had left nothing but dust on his hands and ghosts in his dreams. Then came the child, small, fearless, with eyes that hadn't yet learned to hate. She approached where others wouldn't dare, standing before him with a curiosity that knew no prejudice. Could a child's innocent question heal wounds deeper than any battlefield scar? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nakohi's fingers traced the worn edges of the small medicine pouch hanging from his neck. Inside, sacred items connected him to a past that grew more distant with each passing season. A single eagle feather, a smooth river stone, a lock of black hair. These were all that remained of the man he once was. The Apache had been born Nakohi, the bear, named for the strength his father saw in his infant eyes. That strength had served him well as a respected warrior among his people. His hands, now calloused and weathered, had once been steady enough to craft the finest arrows in his tribe. His eyes, now dim with sorrow, had once spotted game from impossible distances. His voice, now rarely used, had once spoken wisdom in tribal councils. He had married Ayana when both were barely past childhood. Her name meant eternal bloom, and to him, she had been exactly that, a flower that never faded, even in the harshest desert sun. Their son came a year later, a strong boy they named Tebeo, the sun. Together, they had lived in the rhythms of their people, hunting, gathering, celebrating, surviving. The memories flooded back as Nakohi sat on the wooden bench. The distant sounds of the town faded as his mind traveled to that final day. White settlers had been encroaching for years, but their band had maintained an uneasy peace. Then came the cavalry, with their talk of treaties and reservations. The tribe split, some willing to go, others determined to fight. Nakohi had counseled patience, negotiation. Many warriors called him coward. When the massacre came, it found them unprepared. He had been hunting, returning to find smoke rising from their camp. The images still burned in his dreams. Ayana's body shielding their son, both still and silent on the blood-soaked ground. His anguished howl had echoed through the canyons, a sound more animal than human. He had tracked the soldiers for days, watching their camp from distant ridges. Alone, he could not attack directly. Instead, he took his revenge in silence. Horses set free in the night, water supplies contaminated. A single sentry found with his throat cut at each new dawn. They never saw his face, but they felt his grief. When he returned weeks later to what remained of his band, the elders turned him away. His call for peace had been seen as weakness. His failure to protect his family and tribe was unforgivable. Even his acts of vengeance were viewed as inadequate. A warrior should die fighting, not skulk in shadows. "You are no longer Nakohi," the eldest had said. "You are nothing." For 20 years he had wandered, taking odd jobs on remote ranches where owners cared more for strong backs than a man's origins. Sleeping under stars that no longer told him stories. Eating food that no longer nourished his spirit. The emptiness followed him like a shadow, growing longer with each passing year. He kept his medicine pouch close, though its power seemed to have abandoned him. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, he would open it and lay each item on the ground before him. The eagle feather for courage, the river stone for patience, the lock of his wife's hair for love. He would sit until sunrise, then carefully return each item to the pouch, no closer to peace than before. The town he now sat in was no different from countless others. He had stopped remembering their names. They all smelled the same, horse manure and fear. They all sounded the same, whispers that followed him down dusty streets. They all felt the same, cold even in summer heat. Nakohi closed the medicine pouch and tucked it back beneath his faded shirt. Another day of existence without purpose stretched before him. Another night of memories without comfort waited beyond. Until the small voice broke through his isolation. "You look alone, sir. Want to meet my mommy?" Abigail Mason. Abby, to everyone who knew her, clutched her handmade rag doll close to her chest as she skipped along the dusty path that led from her small house to the town well. The doll, sewn together from scraps of fabric by her mother's patient hands, had mismatched button eyes and yarn hair that had once been bright yellow but had faded to a soft wheat color. Abby had named her doll Penny, and she was Abby's most treasured possession and constant companion. At 8 years old, Abby saw the world differently than most in the dusty border town of Redemption. Where adults saw danger, she saw adventure. Where they saw strangers, she saw friends not yet made. Where they saw differences, she saw only variations in the same human fabric, like the colorful scraps that made up Penny's patchwork dress. "Penny," she whispered to the doll as she walked, "today we're going to find someone who needs a smile." This was not an unusual mission for Abby. 3 days earlier, she had shared her apple with old Mr. Henderson, who always sat alone outside the barber shop. The week before, she had picked wildflowers for Mrs. Turner, who had lost her cat to coyotes. Abby had a gift for finding the lonely, the forgotten, the hurting. Her mother called it her special heart. Her mother, Sarah Mason, had raised Abby alone since her father's death 3 years earlier. Their modest house sat at the eastern edge of town, close enough to reach the general store and church on foot, far enough to afford a small plot for gardening and a bit of privacy. The house had 2 rooms, a main living area with a cooking stove and table, and a bedroom they shared. It wasn't much, but Sarah kept it meticulously clean, with wildflowers in a jar on the table and handmade curtains at the windows. Every morning, Sarah rose before dawn to bake bread that she sold to the general store. Every afternoon, she took in mending or washing from wealthier families in town. Every evening, she read to Abby from the Bible or one of the few storybooks they owned. It was a simple life measured in small victories, having enough firewood for winter, patching Abby's dress so skillfully the repair was nearly invisible, finding an extra egg in the hen house. "Remember, Abby," Sarah often told her daughter, "kindness costs nothing but means everything." Abby took this lesson to heart, much to her mother's occasional dismay. Sarah's teaching on kindness was always followed by warnings about caution. "Don't speak to strangers without me nearby," and "some people don't want to be bothered." But to Abby, these seemed like contradictions. How could you be kind to someone if you never approached them? How could you know if someone wanted to be left alone unless you asked? So Abby developed her own system. She watched people first, the way they sat, the look in their eyes, the slope of their shoulders. She had decided, with the simple logic of childhood, that the loneliest people were the ones who needed kindness most. As she approached the town well, balancing the empty water bucket against her hip the way she'd seen her mother do, Abby noticed the figure sitting on the old bench nearby. Even from a distance, she could see what the adults in town seemed to miss. The man wasn't dangerous. He was sad, the saddest person she had ever seen. Abby stopped, considering. Her mother had specifically warned about the Indian man who had appeared in town 3 days ago. "Stay clear of him," Sarah had said firmly. "Some people have had difficult lives that make them unpredictable." But as Abby studied him from afar, all she could see was someone who looked like he hadn't had a friend in a very long time. Someone who might have forgotten what a smile felt like. "Penny," she whispered to her doll, "I think we found today's person." With the water bucket in one hand and Penny tucked securely under her arm, Abby squared her small shoulders and began walking toward the Apache. Nakohi felt the child's approach before he saw her. Years of living in wilderness had honed his senses. The slight change in air current, the barely perceptible sound of small feet on dusty ground, the feeling of being watched by eyes that held no malice. He remained still, gaze fixed on the distant mountains, his body language revealing nothing of his awareness. Most children in towns like this were quickly trained to avoid him. Their initial curiosity inevitably gave way to the fear their parents instilled. He expected this one would be no different. A moment of innocent interest followed by a panicked retreat once she realized what he was. But the footsteps continued, growing closer with steady determination. "Hello," came a small voice, clear and unafraid. Nakohi turned his head slowly, careful to make no sudden movements. The girl stood before him, perhaps 7 or 8 summers old, with sun-browned skin and hair the color of wheat tied in 2 braids. She clutched a ragged doll under one arm and balanced a water bucket with the other. Her eyes, wide and blue as the desert sky, met his directly, something even grown white men rarely did. He said nothing, offering only the slightest nod of acknowledgement. "Are you thirsty?" the girl asked, setting her bucket down. "I'm getting water from the well. I could bring you some." Across the square, Nakohi noticed 2 women stopping to stare, their faces tightening with alarm. A man loading supplies at the general store had frozen mid-task, watching the interaction with one hand drifting toward his belt. The Apache returned his gaze to the child, who waited patiently for his answer, apparently oblivious to the tension she had created. It had been so long since anyone had offered him even this small kindness that he found himself momentarily unsure how to respond. "No," he finally said, his voice rough from disuse. The girl seemed undeterred by his rejection. She studied him with open curiosity, head tilted slightly. "My name's Abby," she offered. "This is Penny." She held up the doll for his inspection. Nakohi looked at the doll with its button eyes and yarn hair, then back at the child. Something in his chest tightened, a feeling almost forgotten. His own son had carried a small wooden horse he had carved. The memory rose unbidden, sharp as a knife. "What's your name?" Abby asked. "No name," he answered quietly. It was simpler than explaining that his name had been taken from him, along with his place in the world. Abby frowned, considering this. "Everyone has a name," she said with the certainty of childhood. "Maybe you just forgot it." A woman's voice called sharply from across the square, "Abigail Mason." The girl turned, waving at one of the watching women. "That's Mrs. Peterson," she explained to Nakohi. "She tells my mama everything." She turned back to the well, lowered the bucket on its rope, and cranked it back up with obvious effort. When she had filled the dipper attached to the well, she brought it to Nakohi without being asked. "You look thirsty even if you say you're not," she stated matter-of-factly. After a moment's hesitation, Nakohi accepted the dipper. The simple act, taking water from a child's hand, felt strangely significant, as if he were breaking some unwritten rule of his isolation. The water was cool and sweet on his tongue. "Thank you," he said, returning the dipper. Abby beamed at him as if he had given her a precious gift rather than the other way around. "You look alone," she said, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Do you want to meet my mommy? She makes the best biscuits in town." Nakohi stared at her, searching for the fear or mockery that must surely lie behind such an invitation. He found only earnest kindness in her gaze. "Abigail Mason, come here this instant." The woman's voice had grown more insistent. Abby sighed dramatically. "I have to go now, but I live in the little house with the blue door at the end of Cottonwood Lane." She gathered her bucket and doll. "You can come for supper. Mama always makes extra." Before he could respond, she was hurrying away, water sloshing from her bucket with each step. Nakohi watched her go, the taste of cool water still on his lips, the unexpected weight of human connection settling uncomfortably on his shoulders. Sarah Mason draped her black shawl over her shoulders as the evening air cooled. The worn fabric had been her constant companion since Thomas died 3 years ago. Some widows eventually put away their mourning clothes, but Sarah found comfort in the familiar weight of the shawl, like the gentle pressure of a hand on her shoulder, reminding her that she had once been loved. She stood in the doorway of their small house, watching the path that led to town. Abby was late returning with water, and Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever her daughter was out of sight for too long. The world had taken her husband. She lived in constant, quiet fear that it might take her child as well. When she finally spotted Abby's small figure on the path, relief washed over her, followed immediately by alarm. The Apache man from town was walking several paces behind her daughter, carrying the water bucket that should have been in Abby's hands. Sarah stepped fully outside, one hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she kept in her apron pocket. Every story she had heard about the Apache warrior flashed through her mind. How he appeared without warning 3 days ago, how he spoke to no one, how Mr. Peterson claimed to recognize him as a renegade from years back with blood on his hands. "Mama!" Abby called, breaking into a run. "I brought a friend for supper." Sarah kept her eyes on the man, who had stopped a respectful distance away. "Abigail Mason," she said in a low, controlled voice. "What have I told you about speaking to strangers?" "He's not a stranger anymore," Abby replied with impeccable 8-year-old logic. "His name is—" She frowned, turning to look back at the Apache. "Well, he says he doesn't have a name, but that can't be right. Everyone has a name." Sarah studied the man standing silently at the edge of their property. Up close, he was not what she expected. His face was weathered but unmenacing, his posture neither threatening nor submissive. He held the water bucket loosely in one hand, making no move to approach further without invitation. "Why is he here, Abby?" Sarah asked, still not addressing the man directly. Abby clutched her doll tighter. "He looked sad and alone. I told him you make the best biscuits in town." She lowered her voice to a whisper that was still perfectly audible. "And he helped me carry the water because it was heavy." The Apache extended the bucket slightly, offering it to Sarah. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, Sarah recognized something familiar in his gaze. The hollow look of someone who had lost everything that mattered. It was the same expression she had seen in her own mirror in the months after Thomas died. She straightened her spine and made a decision. Taking the bucket from his hands, she nodded once. "Thank you for helping my daughter." He returned the nod but remained silent. An awkward moment passed before Sarah spoke again. "Abby says you've been invited to supper." She hesitated, glancing at her daughter's hopeful face. "It's nothing fancy, just beans and biscuits. And applesauce," Abby added enthusiastically. "From our own tree." The Apache looked from mother to daughter, his expression unreadable. Then, with the slightest movement of his head, he accepted. Sarah gestured toward the house. "Come in, then. It'll be dark soon." As she turned to enter, she caught sight of Mrs. Peterson standing on her porch across the way, watching the scene with undisguised disapproval. News would spread through town by morning, the widow Mason entertaining an Apache in her home. There would be consequences. There always were for women who didn't conform to the town's expectations. Sarah straightened her black shawl and led the way inside. She had survived losing Thomas. She had managed alone for 3 years in a town that had little use for a freight driver's widow. Whatever came of this unusual supper, she would face it with the same quiet determination that had carried her this far. Behind her, Abby chattered happily to their silent guest, pointing out the flowers she had picked that morning, showing him the blue jar on the windowsill where she kept special rocks and feathers. The Apache followed, ducking his head slightly to enter the low doorway, bringing with him the scent of dust and open spaces. The small house filled with the rich aroma of baking biscuits and simmering beans. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency in the cooking area, her back straight, her movements precise. She was acutely aware of the Apache's presence, though he had settled silently into the corner farthest from the stove, making himself as unobtrusive as possible. Abby, oblivious to the tension, sat at the table arranging her doll in a position to observe the proceedings. "Penny likes to watch people eat," she explained to their guest. "But she never gets hungry herself." Sarah glanced over her shoulder to gauge the Apache's reaction to her daughter's chatter. His face remained impassive, but she thought she detected the slightest softening around his eyes. When the biscuits had risen to golden perfection, Sarah removed them from the oven and transferred the beans to her best serving dish, a chipped blue bowl that had been a wedding gift from Thomas's mother. 3 mismatched plates were arranged on the table, along with her only 3 forks. They rarely had visitors. "Supper's ready," she announced, more formally than usual. "Abby, put Penny aside and wash your hands, please." As her daughter scampered to comply, Sarah filled a pitcher with water and set it on the table. She hesitated, then addressed the Apache directly for the second time. "Would you care to sit?" He rose smoothly and moved to the table, his moccasins making no sound on the plank floor. Sarah noticed that he chose the seat that kept his back to the wall and his eyes on the door, the habit of a man accustomed to danger. When Abby returned, they sat in awkward silence. Sarah bowed her head. "For what we are about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful. Amen." She looked up to find the Apache watching her with an unreadable expression. "Do Apache people say prayers before eating?" Abby asked, reaching for a biscuit. Sarah started to reprimand her daughter for the personal question, but the Apache answered before she could speak. "Yes." His voice was deep and quiet, and used to conversation. "We give thanks to Creator for the food that sustains us." It was the most he had said since arriving, and Sarah found herself studying him with new interest as she served the beans. His hands, she noticed, were strong but gentle as he accepted the blue bowl from her. There were scars across his knuckles, old wounds from battles or hardships she could only imagine. Abby, encouraged by his response, launched into more questions. "Do you live in town now? Where did you come from? How old are you? Do you have children?" "Abigail," Sarah interrupted sharply, recognizing the pain that flashed momentarily in the Apache's eyes at the last question. "That's enough. Let our guest eat in peace." They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the clink of forks against plates and the distant call of night birds beginning their evening songs. The Apache ate slowly, with dignity, though Sarah suspected it had been some time since he had enjoyed a proper meal. "It's good," he said suddenly, nodding toward his empty plate. "Thank you." The simple words of gratitude seemed to ease something in the room. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly as she served him a second helping. "Mama makes the best biscuits," Abby said proudly. "That's what everybody says." "They're right," the Apache replied, and though his expression hardly changed, Sarah sensed he was making an effort, attempting conversation for Abby's sake. As they finished the meal, Sarah noticed the uneven leg on the table wobbling dangerously when Abby leaned too hard against it. It had been that way for months, another repair she hadn't found time or skill to address. The Apache noticed too. When the meal was complete, he gestured toward the table. "I can fix this, before I go." Sarah hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. "That's not necessary. I would like to," he said simply. "For the meal." Their eyes met across the table, and Sarah understood this was not merely about a wobbly table leg. It was an offering, the only one he had to give, a small exchange of value to preserve his dignity. She nodded once. "Thank you. That would be helpful." Outside, darkness had fallen completely. The single oil lamp cast long shadows across the small room, shadows that seemed to recede slightly as they finished their meal in a silence that was no longer quite so strained. Morning light streamed through the windows of Parsons' General Store as Harold Parson himself carefully recorded the latest transaction in his ledger. His pencil paused over Sarah Mason's name, lingering on the growing column of numbers beside it. The widow's debt had increased steadily over the past winter. Nothing outrageous, but concerning nonetheless. He would need to have a conversation with her soon about payment arrangements. The bell above the door jingled as Edith Peterson swept in, removing her gloves with the air of someone carrying important news. "Harold," she announced without preamble. "That Indian is still here." Parsons set down his pencil. "The Apache? Thought he'd have moved on by now." "Not only is he still here," Edith continued, lowering her voice dramatically though they were alone in the store. "He spent the night at Sarah Mason's place." Harold's eyebrows shot up. "That can't be right. I saw it with my own eyes." Edith leaned against the counter. "He followed little Abby home yesterday, carrying her water bucket bold as brass. Sarah invited him in for supper, and he was still there when the lights went out. This morning, I saw him chopping wood in her yard at first light." The storekeeper frowned, glancing down at his ledger. "That don't sound like Sarah. She's always been proper, even after Thomas passed." "Well, she's made a grave error in judgment this time." Edith selected a spool of thread, turning it absently in her fingers. "I've already spoken with Reverend Collins. He agrees it's most concerning." By mid-morning, the store had filled with the usual weekday traffic. Ranchers' wives picking up supplies, men gathering to exchange news over coffee. The topic of conversation never strayed far from Sarah Mason and the Apache. "I heard he's one of them renegades that raided the Miller place back in '53, offered George Taylor, stroking his gray beard. "Killed 3 men before disappearing into the hills." "That's not the same Indian," countered Frank Wilson. "This one's older, quieter." "They're all the same when they've got a mind to cause trouble," George insisted. "Sarah's playing with fire, having him around her girl." Sheriff Davis pushed through the door just as the debate was heating up. He removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair as he approached the gathered men. "Heard we got a situation brewing," he said, helping himself to coffee. Harold Parson nodded toward the street. "Widow Mason's taken in that Apache. Folks are concerned." The sheriff sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Man hasn't broken any laws that I know of. Being Indian ain't a crime." "What about vagrancy?" pressed Edith Peterson, who had lingered to witness the men's discussion. "He's got no visible means of support." "Seems he's supporting himself now by helping the widow," observed Frank Wilson. "Saw him fixing her roof this morning." Reverend Collins entered, bringing with him the scent of pipe tobacco and moral authority. The small group parted to make room for him at the counter. "Brothers and sisters," he began solemnly, "while we must always show Christian charity, we cannot ignore potential dangers in our midst. The good book teaches us to be wise as serpents, gentle as doves." "Amen," murmured Edith Peterson. "I propose to pay Sarah a pastoral visit this afternoon," the Reverend continued, "to assess the situation and offer guidance." Sheriff Davis replaced his hat. "I'll come along. Keep things civil." As the men dispersed, Harold Parson returned to his ledger, tapping his pencil against Sarah Mason's outstanding balance. Perhaps this situation offered an opportunity. A woman in her position couldn't afford to alienate the town's goodwill, not with winter coming and debts to settle. By noon, Sarah herself entered the store, a basket over her arm, her black shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders despite the warm day. A hush fell over the customers as she approached the counter. "Morning, Harold," she said calmly. "I need flour and sugar, please." The storekeeper measured out her items, acutely aware of the watching eyes. "That'll be 85 cents, he said, then added in a lower voice, "Sarah, there's talk about your guest." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Is there? People are concerned. A woman alone, with a child." He glanced meaningfully at her account in the ledger. "You've always been a valued customer. Be a shame if folks started taking their mending elsewhere." Sarah's spine stiffened. Are you refusing to sell to me, Harold? No, no, he backpedaled quickly. Just offering friendly advice. Sheriff and Reverend Collins are planning to stop by your place this afternoon. Might be best if your visitor made himself scarce before then. Sarah placed exact change on the counter. Thank you for the warning, she said, her voice quiet but firm. And for the supplies. As she left the store, whispers followed her like shadows. Dawn had barely broken when Nakohi gathered his few possessions. The small bundle contained all that remained of his life. The medicine pouch, a knife with an antler handle, a blanket traded for work at a ranch 2 summers ago. He had spent the night in Sarah Mason's shed, a clean, dry space that offered more comfort than many places he had slept over the years. He had heard the whispers in town the previous day while repairing Sarah's roof. The Apache's ears were still sharp, catching fragments of conversation from passing townspeople. Their suspicion, their fear, their judgment. He had seen the way the storekeeper watched Sarah when she returned from shopping, her back straight but her face troubled. Nakohi knew the pattern well. His presence brought difficulty to those who showed him kindness. Better to move on before the trouble grew worse. He walked to the broken fence at the edge of Sarah's small property. 3 posts needed replacing, and several rails had rotted through. He studied the damage in the strengthening light, calculating what would be required to make sound again. One final task before he disappeared from their lives. The back door opened, and Sarah stepped out, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. She carried 2 cups of steaming coffee. Wordlessly, she offered one to him. Nakohi accepted with a slight nod of thanks. The hot liquid warmed his hands as much as his insides. You're leaving, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He gestured toward the fence. After I fix this. Sarah studied the damaged fence, then looked back at him. Why? The question surprised him. Most people were relieved when he moved on. My staying brings trouble, he answered simply. Trouble finds me with or without your help, Sarah replied, a hint of wry humor in her voice. She sipped her coffee, then added, The sheriff and Reverend Collins are coming this afternoon to discuss my situation. Nakohi nodded. Another reason to be gone before midday. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun creep above the distant hills. A roadrunner darted across the yard, disappearing into a patch of scrub brush. The town has always found reasons to talk about me, Sarah said finally. First for marrying Thomas when my father opposed it. Then for moving west when decent women stayed home. Now for managing alone instead of remarrying. She shrugged slightly. Their opinions matter less to me with each passing year. Nakohi studied her profile in the morning light. There was strength in her face. Not the brash confidence he had seen in frontier women who wore their independence like armor, but something quieter and more enduring. The child should not suffer for your choices, he said. Abby. Sarah turned to face him fully. She suffers more from this town's narrow thinking than from any guest in our home. They've already decided she's strange for her openness, her questions, her willingness to see good in others. She paused. In that way, she's very much like her father. From inside the house came the sound of small feet hitting the floor. Abby would be awake soon. There's work here, Sarah said, gesturing to the fence, the shed's leaking roof, the garden plot overrun with weeds. More than I can manage alone before winter. I can't pay much, but there's food and shelter. She met his eyes directly. If you choose to stay. Nakohi recognized the offer for what it was, not charity but an exchange. His labor for her protection. His skills for a place to belong, however temporarily. Before he could respond, Abby burst from the house, still in her nightdress, hair tousled from sleep. You're still here, she exclaimed, running to Nakohi with unguarded delight. Are you going to stay for breakfast? Mama makes Johnny cakes on Thursdays. Looking at the child's hopeful face, Nakohi felt something shift inside him, like ground thawing after a long winter. The decision crystallized, not in words but in certainty. He set down his small bundle next to the broken fence post. "The fence first," he said quietly. "Then breakfast." Sarah's expression remained composed, but he caught the relief in her eyes. With a small nod, she turned back toward the house, guiding Abby with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Come along, Abby. Let's get those Johnny cakes started while Mr." She paused, glancing back at him with a question in her eyes. "Nakohi," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so long. "My name is Nakohi." Days settled into a rhythm as autumn deepened around the small house at the edge of town. Each morning, Nakohi rose before dawn, rekindled the kitchen fire, and had coffee brewing by the time Sarah emerged from the bedroom she shared with Abby. They would share this quiet time together, watching the sun rise through the eastern window, speaking little but growing comfortable in each other's silence. When Abby woke, the energy in the house shifted, her chatter filling the spaces, her questions and observations drawing reluctant words from Nakohi and soft smiles from her mother. After breakfast, Sarah would head to town with her basket of baked goods for the general store or laundered linens for the hotel, walking the gauntlet of stairs and whispers with her chin held high. Those first days after the sheriff and Reverend's visit had been tense. The men had been civil enough, their concerns couched in terms of propriety and safety rather than outright prejudice. Sarah had listened politely to their warnings, thanked them for their concern, and firmly closed the door behind them. If they expected the Apache to be gone the next day, they were disappointed. While Sarah worked in town, Nakohi transformed the property with quiet industry. The fence was mended first, then the shed reinforced, the chicken coop expanded. He cleared stones from the small garden plot, turning the soil to prepare it for spring planting. His strong hands, once used for war, now created and restored with the same focused intensity. Abby would follow him like a shadow when not at her lessons, watching his every move with fascinated attention. At first, Nakohi had been unsure how to respond to her constant presence, but gradually he began explaining his tasks in short, simple sentences, teaching her the names of tools in Apache, showing her how to test wood for rot, how to judge the weather from the behavior of birds and insects. "Two," he said one afternoon, pointing to the water bucket. "Two," Abby repeated carefully, her young tongue navigating the unfamiliar sound. "Good," he nodded. "Water." In the evenings, after Abby was asleep, Sarah would sew by lamplight while Nakohi carved at the table. From a piece of pine salvaged from the fence repair, he shaped a small figure, his knife moving in sure, deliberate strokes. Over several nights it took form, a horse with flowing mane and alert ears. "For the child," he explained when he caught Sarah watching. "When it's finished." Sarah's needle paused above her mending. "She'll treasure it." After a moment she added, "Thomas used to whittle. Nothing as fine as that, but Abby loved watching him create something from nothing." Nakohi nodded, understanding the gift of this shared memory. They had begun to exchange these small confidences in the quiet evenings, brief glimpses into their pasts, offered and received with care. From town, the scrutiny continued. Customers who had once sought Sarah's baking now found reasons to purchase elsewhere. Children who had played with Abby were suddenly too busy when she approached. The preacher's sermon on guarding against worldly influences left little doubt about its target. Yet within the small house, a different world was taking shape. One Sunday morning, as Sarah prepared to walk to church alone, Abby having developed a convenient cough, a sound stopped her at the door. Nakohi was laughing, a quiet rumble that seemed to surprise him as much as her. Abby had been demonstrating how her doll could dance, twirling the rag doll in increasingly elaborate pirouettes until it spun out of her hands. Sarah watched the Apache retrieve the doll from where it had landed, His usually stern face softened with amusement. Their eyes met across the room, and something passed between them, a recognition of the unexpected life blooming in this unlikely soil. From her window across the way, Mrs. Peterson observed the smoke rising from the mason chimney, the newly mended fence, the Apache splitting wood with precise, powerful strokes. Her disapproval deepened when she saw little Abby skipping alongside him, carrying a stick in imitation of his axe. But what troubled her most was the change in Sarah, the straightening of her shoulders, the occasional smile that now touched her lips, the quiet defiance in her eyes when they met in town. It wasn't proper. It wasn't safe. And Edith Peterson had appointed herself guardian of both propriety and safety in their small community. The day began like any other, with no hint of what was to come. Nakohi noticed the change first. A stillness in the air, a particular quality to the light that turned the morning sky a strange, sickly yellow. By midday, dark clouds had gathered on the western horizon, building into towering anvils that promised more than a passing shower. "Storm coming," he told Sarah as she hung laundry, his eyes on the distant thunderheads. "A bad one." Sarah glanced at the sky, then quickly began gathering the wet clothes from the line. "We'd better prepare. These autumn storms can turn violent without warning." Together they secured the property, bringing chickens into their coop, moving tools to the shed, gathering loose items that might become projectiles in high wind. Nakohi examined the roof critically, noting places where recent repairs might not hold against driving rain. "I'll check the north corner again," he said, already moving toward the ladder he had propped against the house. "The last patch needs reinforcing." By the time Abby returned from her half-day at the small town school, the wind had picked up considerably, driving dust and leaves before it. Her hair whipped around her face as she ran the last stretch to the house, clutching her slate and books tightly against her chest. "Miss Wilson let us out early," she explained breathlessly. "She said there's a big storm coming and we should all hurry home." Sarah ushered her inside as the first fat raindrops began to fall. "Just in time. Go change into dry clothes while I start supper." Through the window, she watched Nakohi on the roof, working quickly to secure a loose section of shingling. The rain intensified rapidly, becoming a gray sheet that obscured everything beyond the yard. Lightning flashed, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that rattled the windows. When Nakohi finally came through the door, he was soaked to the skin, water streaming from his long hair and clothes. "The roof?" Sarah asked, handing him a towel. "It will hold," he replied with simple confidence. The storm's fury increased as evening deepened into night. Rain hammered against the windows and roof, while wind howled around the corners of the house like a living thing seeking entry. Despite Nakohi's repairs, water soon began to seep through the ceiling in the corner of the main room, dripping steadily into a pot Sarah positioned beneath it. Abby huddled close to her mother on the small sofa, flinching at each thunderclap. "Will our house blow away?" she whispered, eyes wide with fear. "No, sweet girl," Sarah assured her, though her own gaze drifted worriedly to the ceiling where water stains were spreading. "We're safe here." Nakohi moved silently to examine the leak, then disappeared into the shed, returning with a piece of canvas and tools. Without discussion, he dragged the table beneath the damaged section and climbed onto it, beginning to work on a temporary fix from the inside. A particularly violent gust slammed into the house, and the window nearest Abby rattled so forcefully it seemed it might shatter. The child whimpered, burying her face against her mother's side. Nakohi glanced down from his work. "In my tribe," he said, his voice steady and calm, "we tell stories during storms, to remind the children that the thunder is not something to fear." Abby peeked up at him. "What kind of stories?" "About thunder beings," he replied, securing the canvas to catch the leaking water and redirect it to the pot. "Powerful spirits who ride across the sky on black horses with hooves of lightning." "Are they bad spirits?" Abby asked, momentarily forgetting her fear in her curiosity. "No," Nakohi said, climbing down from the table. "They cleanse the world, bring new life through rain. But they are powerful, so we respect them." He settled on the floor near the fireplace, his back against the wall, eyes on the frightened child. "Would you like to hear the story of how Coyote once tried to steal Thunderbeing's voice?" Abby nodded eagerly, leaving her mother's side to sit closer to Nakohi. Sarah watched as the Apache's deep, quiet voice spun a tale of the trickster Coyote and his foolish attempt to capture the power of thunder in a deerskin bag. Despite the storm's continued rage outside, Abby's fear gradually gave way to giggles at Coyote's misadventures. As the night deepened, the three of them remained in the main room, unwilling to separate with the storm still battering the small house. Sarah brought blankets, making a nest of sorts on the floor before the fireplace. Abby, exhausted from fear and excitement, soon drifted to sleep between them, one hand clutching her doll, the other resting trustingly against Nakohi's arm. In the flickering firelight, over the sleeping child, Sarah's eyes met Nakohi's. No words were spoken, but something profound passed between them, a recognition of the fragile shelter they had built, not just of wood and canvas, but of shared stories and quiet trust. The storm left its mark on redemption. Fences down, signs torn away, the church steeple listing dangerously to one side. But Sarah's little house stood firm, protected by Nakohi's careful preparations and timely repairs. 3 days after the storm, as life in town began returning to normal, the sound of approaching horses broke the morning quiet. Nakohi, splitting wood in the yard, paused mid-swing, his body tensing at the sight of 5 mounted men led by Sheriff Davis, his badge catching the sunlight as they approached. Sarah emerged from the house, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. She moved to stand near Nakohi, not quite beside him but close enough to present a united front. "Morning, Sarah," the sheriff called, reining in his horse at the newly mended gate. "Got some concerned citizens here who'd like a word." Behind him sat Harold Parson, Reverend Collins, and 2 other men from town, George Taylor with his gray beard and Frank Wilson, whose wife had once been Sarah's friend before Thomas died. "This is my property, Sheriff," Sarah replied evenly, "and I'm rather busy this morning." "Now, Sarah," Reverend Collins leaned forward in his saddle, his expression a practiced blend of concern and authority. "We're here out of Christian duty. The town's been patient, but the situation has gone on long enough." Harold Parson nodded gravely. "Folks are uncomfortable, Sarah, having a savage living so close to town, especially with a child in the house." Nakohi remained silent, his face impassive, though his grip tightened on the axe handle. "Mr. Nakohi has been nothing but helpful and respectful," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the slight tremor in her hands, "which is more than I can say for those spreading gossip about my household." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "No one's questioning your right to manage your affairs, Sarah, but there are considerations beyond your property line." "What considerations?" Sarah challenged. George Taylor spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "Indians can't be trusted. This one may seem tame now, but they're savages by nature. Just a matter of time before." "Before what?" Sarah interrupted, color rising in her cheeks. "Before he fixes another roof, builds another chicken coop, teaches my daughter about the stars." The confrontation had drawn Abby to the doorway, her small face solemn as she watched the mounted men. Seeing her, Reverend Collins softened his tone. "Sarah, think of the child. What example are you setting? The impropriety of a single woman housing a man, any man, not to mention a heathen." "I'll thank you not to concern yourself with my propriety or my daughter's moral education," Sarah cut in, her voice cold with anger. "Nakohi sleeps in the shed, earns his keep through honest work, and has shown more Christian charity than I've seen from those who fill your pews each Sunday." Frank Wilson, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up. It ain't just about that, Sarah. People are saying they won't do business with you anymore. Won't buy your bread, won't bring mending. You're hurting yourself and Abby by being stubborn. Sarah's face paled slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. Then I'll find other ways to manage. Harold Parson cleared his throat. There's also the matter of your account at the store. I've been patient, but with winter coming, the implied threat hung in the air between them. I see, Sarah said quietly. So this isn't about concern for my welfare at all. It's about controlling who I allow on my property and in my home. Be reasonable, Sarah, the sheriff said. No one wants trouble here. Throughout the exchange, Nakohi had remained silent, his dark eyes taking in every word, every gesture. Now he set down his axe carefully and stepped forward, drawing all eyes to him. I will go, he said simply. No! The word burst from Abby as she ran from the doorway to grasp Nakohi's hand. You can't leave. You belong with us now. Sarah's eyes met Nakohi's over the child's head. Something passed between them, a current of understanding, of shared resolve. No, Sarah echoed her daughter, her voice quiet but steel strong. This is my property, paid for with my husband's life insurance. The deed is in my name. Who I invite to stay here is my decision alone. She turned back to the mounted men. I appreciate your concern, gentlemen, but I believe we're done here. Sheriff Davis studied her for a long moment, then sighed. You've got 3 days, Sarah. Either he's gone by then, or we'll be forced to take further steps. For your own protection. He touched the brim of his hat. Good day to you. As the men turned their horses, Reverend Collins lingered. I'll pray for you, Sarah, he said, managing to make the words sound more like a threat than a comfort. You do that, Reverend, Sarah replied, her hand finding Abby's shoulder. And I'll pray for you. They watched in silence as the riders disappeared down the road, dust rising behind them like a storm cloud on the horizon. That night, after Abby had been tucked into bed with reassurances that no one would take Nakohi away, Sarah sat alone on the porch steps. The confrontation had left her drained yet strangely clear-headed, as if a decision long in the making had finally crystallized within her. She touched the thin gold band that hung on a string around her neck. Thomas's wedding ring, too large for her finger but too precious to store away. The cool metal grounded her, a tangible connection to the man who had promised her adventure and delivered exactly that, though not in the way either had imagined. The soft sound of footsteps made her look up. Nakohi stood in the yard, a respectful distance away, his expression questioning. When she nodded slightly, he approached and settled on the step below hers, the wood creaking softly beneath his weight. You should not fight your people for me, he said after a moment of silence. The child needs a place here. Sarah's fingers continued to work the gold band, sliding it along its string like a worry bead. They're not my people, she said quietly. They never have been. Nakohi turned slightly, studying her profile in the fading light. I was 18 when I met Thomas, Sarah began, her eyes on the distant hills. He delivered freight to my father's store in Pennsylvania. He talked about the West, the open spaces, the freedom, the future waiting to be built. A small smile touched her lips. I was engaged to the banker's son. A good match, everyone said. Secure. Respectable. She paused, remembering. Thomas stayed in town for 3 days. On the 4th morning, I left a note for my father and rode out with Thomas in his wagon. The ring spun between her fingers. We were married in Ohio by a justice of the peace. My father wrote to say I was dead to him. Nakohi nodded once, understanding the weight of such a severance. Thomas was a good man, Sarah continued. Kind, hard-working. He promised we'd have our own place someday, not just rooms above someone else's business. When I became pregnant with Abby, he took a contract with the Army, delivering supplies to Western forts. The pay was better, but the routes were dangerous. She fell silent, gathering herself for the next part of the story. Nakohi waited, patient and still. We had just bought this house when Thomas took ill. A fever that started with a chill one evening and burned him away in less than a week. Her voice remained steady, though her fingers tightened around the ring. The army still owed him money. It took 8 months to get his final pay. By then, everyone in town knew I was alone, with no family to turn to. She looked directly at Nakohi. The men came first, widowers needing housekeepers, ranch hands offering protection. Even the Reverend suggested a suitable match, a 50-year-old elder with grown children. Her mouth tightened. When I refused them all, the offers changed. Harold Parson was willing to extend credit for a special arrangement. Sheriff Davis suddenly had time to check on the widow regularly, especially after dark. Nakohi's expression darkened, but he remained silent. I kept my doors locked and a rifle loaded, Sarah said. Eventually, they accepted I wouldn't be an easy conquest. That's when the other pressure began. Subtle at first, hesitation to do business with me, comments about Abby needing a father's guidance, suggestions that a woman alone invites trouble. She tucked the ring back inside her dress. So you see, what happened today isn't about you, not really. It's about a woman who refuses to be controlled. They tolerated my independence as long as it seemed temporary. Now you're here, and they see I might actually succeed without bending to their expectations. Nakohi was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her story. Finally, he spoke. My people believe that each person has their own path to walk. Others may walk beside you for a time, but no one can walk your path for you. Sarah nodded slowly. Thomas understood that. He never tried to change my path, only invited me to walk beside him on his. She looked at Nakohi directly. I won't let them force you from your path either. And if they come again? He asked. Then we'll face them together, Sarah replied, the certainty in her voice matching the resolve in her eyes. This is my home. I decide who belongs here. Between them, unspoken but understood, hung the truth that had been building since that first meal shared at her table. Somehow, against all odds, Nakohi had begun to belong. Dawn found Nakohi kneeling beside his bedroll in the shed, the contents of his medicine pouch arranged before him in a small circle. The eagle feather, the river stone, the lock of Ayana's hair. Beside them lay his knife, an old weapon with a blade that had seen both battle and practical use, its antler handle worn smooth from years of handling. 2 days had passed since the confrontation. 2 days of watchful waiting, of Sarah's determined routine continuing despite the cloud hanging over them. 2 days of Abby's worried glances whenever she thought he wasn't looking. 1 day remained before the sheriff's deadline. Nakohi ran his thumb along the knife's edge, feeling its sharpness, considering its purpose. 20 years of wandering had taught him when to fight and when to disappear. The sensible choice was clear: gather his few possessions and vanish before more trouble came. The Apache knew the hidden paths, the secret places where white men wouldn't follow. He could be miles away by nightfall, leaving no trail. And yet, his fingers moved from the knife to the river stone, smooth and cool against his palm. His father had given it to him when he became a man, telling him, "When the path is unclear, be like water. Find the way around obstacles. Remain patient, but never stop moving forward." The question that troubled his meditation was simple yet profound. What was moving forward? Was it continuing his solitary existence, a ghost drifting through a world that had no place for him? Or was it here, in this unlikely sanctuary, where a widow and her child had seen him as a man rather than a savage? The sound of Abby's laughter drifted from the house, followed by Sarah's quieter voice. Something tightened in Nakohi's chest, an ache both sweet and painful. In the weeks since he had arrived, the constant hollow feeling inside him had begun to fill, like a dry riverbed receiving the first tentative streams after drought. He closed his eyes, seeking guidance from ancestors long silent. The Apache way taught that all decisions affected not just the individual but the circle of life extending 7 generations forward and back. What would his choice mean for Sarah and Abby in the days to come? The shed door creaked open, startling him from his meditation. Abby stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light, Penny the doll clutched in one hand. "Mama says breakfast is ready," she announced, then hesitated, noticing the items arranged on the floor. "Are you praying?" Nakohi carefully gathered the sacred objects, returning them to the medicine pouch. "Listening," he corrected gently. "To what?" Abby entered the shed, curious as always. "To what my heart knows is right," he answered, surprising himself with the honesty of his response. Abby nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Is your heart telling you to stay with us?" she asked, the directness of childhood cutting through to the heart of his dilemma. Before he could answer, running footsteps approached. Sarah appeared in the doorway, slightly breathless. "Abby, I told you not to disturb." She stopped, taking in the scene. Nakohi kneeling with his medicine pouch, the knife still laid out before him. Her expression shifted from mild exasperation to understanding. "You're preparing to leave." It wasn't a question, but there was no accusation in her voice. Only a quiet acceptance that tore at something deep within him. "The sheriff comes tomorrow," he said simply. Sarah's chin lifted slightly. "I meant what I said. This is my property. My decision. Their anger will fall on you," Nakohi replied. "On the child." "We've faced their anger before," Sarah said, though a shadow crossed her face. Abby moved to stand beside her mother, looking from one adult to the other with solemn eyes. "Are the bad men coming back?" Sarah stroked her daughter's hair. "They're not bad men exactly. They're just afraid of things they don't understand." "Like Nakohi?" Abby frowned. "But he's not scary." "To them I am," Nakohi said gently. He rose to his feet, tucking the medicine pouch inside his shirt but leaving the knife on the floor. A decision not yet made. Sarah met his eyes, and in that moment, he saw not just her strength but her vulnerability. The weight she carried alone, the future she faced in a town determined to break her independence. "Sarah," he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it felt right on his tongue, like a word he had always known but never spoken. In that single word, her name, lay his decision. He would not run again. Not from this place where, against all odds, he had found something worth protecting. Not from these two who had looked past his scars and silences to see the man beneath. The path forward was here. The sheriff's deadline came and went with no visitors to Sarah's property. For 3 tense days, they maintained their routines while watching the road, waiting for confrontation that didn't materialize. By the 4th morning, Sarah allowed herself to hope that perhaps the town had decided to let the matter rest. The illusion of peace shattered shortly after noon. Nakohi was repairing a loose board on the chicken coop when he heard the riders approaching. Not just a few men this time, but what sounded like a dozen or more. He straightened, setting down his hammer with deliberate calm, and moved toward the house where Sarah was teaching Abby her letters. "They're coming," he said simply from the doorway. Sarah's face paled, but she nodded, rising from the table. "Abby, go to our room and stay there until I call you." "But Mama." "Now, Abby." Sarah's tone left no room for argument. When the child had reluctantly disappeared into the bedroom, Sarah turned to Nakohi. "How many?" "Many," he replied. "More than before." She squared her shoulders, smoothing her apron with hands that trembled slightly. "Whatever happens, don't give them reason to claim you were violent. That's what they want." Nakohi understood. Any aggressive move from him would justify whatever they had planned. He nodded once, then followed Sarah onto the porch as the riders came into view. Sheriff Davis led the group as before, but this time he was flanked by a dozen men, some armed with rifles, others with ropes coiled at their saddles. Harold Parson rode near the front, a folded paper clutched in his hand, his face set with grim determination. "Sarah," the sheriff called as they approached the gate. "Step aside. We've come for the Indian." Sarah remained on the porch, arms crossed over her chest. "On what grounds, Sheriff?" Harold Parson urged his horse forward, unfolding the paper with a theatrical flourish. "I have here a receipt showing items stolen from my store yesterday afternoon. Ammunition, tobacco, and a silver pocket watch." He paused for effect. "And I have a witness who saw your Apache leaving my store around that time." "That's impossible," Sarah replied evenly. "Nakohe was here all day yesterday, helping me repair the roof." "You saying my wife's a liar?" Parson demanded. "Edith saw him plain as day, skulking around the back of the store." Murmurs rippled through the mounted men, their faces hardening with the confirmation of what they had always believed, that the savage among them could not be trusted. "I did not take these things," Nakohe said, his voice calm despite the danger surrounding them. George Taylor spat into the dust. "Like we'd take an Indian's word over a white woman's." The sheriff dismounted, approaching the gate with his hand resting pointedly on his holstered pistol. "I have a duty to investigate this theft. You'll need to come with us, Chief." "He is not going anywhere," Sarah said, moving to stand between Nakohe and the gate. "This is nothing but a trumped-up charge to drive him away." "Step aside, Sarah," the sheriff warned. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." From behind them came the sound of the bedroom door opening. Abby appeared, her small face pinched with fear as she took in the scene. "Mama!" "Go back inside, Abby," Sarah called without turning. Instead, the child ran to Nakohe, wrapping her arms around his leg. "Don't let them take you," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. The men watched this display with varying expressions: discomfort, disgust, resolve. Frank Wilson, near the back of the group, removed his hat, looking suddenly uncertain. "See what you've done?" Harold Parson demanded, gesturing toward Abby. "Turned the child against her own kind, made her think a savage is family." Sarah's face flushed with anger. "You're the ones frightening a child with your mob justice. Where's your Christian charity now, Harold? Where's your sense of decency?" The sheriff sighed heavily. "I didn't want it to come to this." He turned to the mounted men. "Johnson, Williams, secure the Indian. The rest of you keep watch. Anyone interferes, they'll be charged with obstruction." 2 men dismounted, tying their horses to Sarah's fence before approaching the gate. One carried a pair of iron handcuffs that glinted dully in the afternoon sun. Nakohe gently disengaged Abby's arms from around his leg, kneeling to meet her tear-filled eyes. "Be brave, little one," he said softly. "Help your mother." Rising to his full height, he faced Sarah. In her eyes, he saw fury, fear, and something deeper that made his decision clear. There would be no resistance that might endanger her or the child. Whatever justice awaited him in town, he would face it with dignity. "I will go," he told her quietly. "For now." Sarah reached out impulsively, her fingers closing around his wrist. "This isn't over," she whispered fiercely. As the men approached with their handcuffs, Nakohe squared his shoulders and stepped forward, leaving the safety of the porch for whatever lay ahead. Behind him, Abby's sobs tore at his heart, but he did not look back. The accusation was false, but the danger was real. He had survived worse, he reminded himself. Yet somehow the prospect of being taken from this place, from them, cut deeper than any threat to his own life. The jail in Redemption was little more than a sturdy shed with iron bars on the windows and a heavy padlock on the door. Inside, Nakohe sat motionless on a narrow cot, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts as the evening shadows lengthened across the dirt floor. Meanwhile, Sarah moved through town like a woman possessed, her black shawl billowing behind her as she marched from door to door. Abby had been left in the reluctant care of Mrs. Wilson, the schoolteacher who had always shown Sarah more kindness than most in town. "I know he's innocent," Sarah insisted to Frank Wilson, who stood uncomfortably in his doorway, his wife hovering behind him. "He was with me all day. The roof still shows the fresh patches he applied." Frank shifted his weight, not quite meeting her eyes. "Sarah, the whole town heard Edith's testimony. Said she saw him plain as day, coming out the back of the store with a bundle under his arm. Edith Peterson has been trying to drive us apart since the day Nakohe arrived," Sarah countered. "Ask yourself why she was behind the store in the first place." A flicker of doubt crossed Frank's face. "What are you asking of me, Sarah? Stand with me tomorrow when the sheriff holds his hearing. Tell them you've seen the work Nakohe has done, how he's behaved honorably all these weeks." After a long pause, Frank nodded slightly. "I'll think on it. It wasn't much, but it was a start." Sarah continued her rounds as dusk settled over redemption. Some doors remained firmly shut against her knocking. Others opened only wide enough for the occupant to offer a curt refusal before closing again. But a few, those who had worked with Thomas, who had traded fairly with Sarah over the years, listened. By the time she reached the small church on the edge of town, Sarah had gathered 4 tentative promises of support. Not enough, but better than facing the town alone. Reverend Collins answered her knock, surprise registering on his face. "Sarah, I didn't expect to see you here. May I come in, Reverend? There's something I need to discuss." Inside the modest church, Sarah sat in the front pew, gathering her thoughts as the Reverend waited with uncharacteristic patience. "You've known me for 3 years, she began. "Have I ever lied to you?" "No," he admitted. "You've always been direct, sometimes uncomfortably so." Sarah reached into her pocket and withdrew her most precious possession, the family Bible that had belonged to Thomas's mother. Its leather cover was worn smooth with age and use, the gilt edges of its pages faded but still gleaming in the lamplight. "Tomorrow I will swear on this Bible that Nakohe was with me all day when the theft occurred. I will testify that he has never taken anything that wasn't freely given, that he has worked honestly for his keep, and that he has shown nothing but respect to me and my daughter." The Reverend studied her face. "You seem very certain." "I am certain," Sarah replied. "The question is whether you will allow an innocent man to be condemned based on one woman's questionable testimony." Collins sighed, removing his spectacles to polish them with a handkerchief. "Harold Parson is a prominent member of this community, Sarah. His wife's word carries weight." "And the word of a widow counts for nothing?" Sarah challenged. "Or is it that you've already decided Nakohe must be guilty because of what he is rather than who he is?" The Reverend replaced his spectacles, regarding her thoughtfully. "You care for him." It wasn't a question, and Sarah didn't treat it as one. "I care for justice, Reverend. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." "That's from your book, not mine." For a long moment, Collins was silent, his fingers tracing the worn edge of the pulpit. Finally, he nodded. "I'll speak with the sheriff. Ask him to ensure a fair hearing." It wasn't the full support she had hoped for, but it was something. Dawn found Sarah at Harold Parsons' store, not at the front entrance where customers normally entered, but circling to the narrow alley behind the building. She studied the back door critically, noting the heavy padlock that secured it and the small window, too high for a child but easily reached by an adult. As she examined the ground beneath the window, something caught her eye, a gleam of metal half buried in the mud. Kneeling, Sarah carefully extracted a small silver pocket watch, its case dented and dirty, but unmistakably the one Parson had reported stolen. A slow smile spread across her face as she pocketed the evidence. Perhaps Providence was on their side after all. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office. Sarah stood at its edge, Abby's hand clutched tightly in hers, the recovered watch a reassuring weight in her pocket. When the sheriff emerged with Nakohe in handcuffs, a hush fell over the assembled townspeople. Sarah straightened her spine, adjusted her black shawl, and stepped forward to make her stand. The hearing was brief but fierce. In the cramped confines of the sheriff's office, Sarah presented the mud-encrusted pocket watch, her voice steady as she described finding it behind Parsons' store, not in Nakohi's possession as claimed. When she placed her hand on Thomas's Bible and swore that Nakohi had been working on their roof all day, several of the men shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to call a widow a liar while her hand rested on scripture. Frank Wilson's reluctant testimony that he had seen Nakohi working on the roof that very afternoon tipped the scales. Edith Peterson's face had flushed crimson, her stammered explanations growing less convincing by the moment. In the end, even Harold Parson couldn't maintain the accusation in the face of the evidence and community doubt. Insufficient cause to hold him, the sheriff had finally declared, though his tone suggested he was doing everyone a favor rather than admitting a mistake. Nakohi's return to Sarah's home was quiet, without ceremony or celebration. Only Abby's fierce hug and whispered, "I knew you'd come back," marked the significance of the moment. That evening, they resumed their routine as if the separation had never occurred. Supper at the small table, Abby's chatter filling the silences, Sarah's steady presence anchoring them all. Yet something had changed. The town's hostility, once simmering beneath a veneer of civility, had bubbled to the surface and been exposed for what it was, fear masquerading as righteousness. The false accusation, so easily disproven, had caused some to question whether their judgment of the Apache had been equally unfounded. 3 days after Nakohi's return, as autumn edged toward winter, a frantic pounding at the door interrupted their evening meal. Sarah opened it to find Mrs. Taylor, the storekeeper's wife, her face tear-streaked and desperate. "It's Jimmy," she gasped. "My grandson." The fever came on sudden-like. "He's burning up and thrashing something terrible. Doc Wilson's away in Carson City." Her eyes darted to Nakohi, who had risen from the table. They say your people know herbs and such. For healing." Sarah glanced at Nakohi, the question unspoken but clear. "I know some ways," he acknowledged quietly. "But not all fevers are the same." "Please," Mrs. Taylor begged. "He's only 4. Without hesitation, Nakohi reached for the small medicine bundle he kept in the shed. Not his personal pouch, but a larger collection of dried plants and roots he had gathered during his weeks in the area. Sarah grabbed her shawl, instructed Abby to bar the door behind them, and followed the two toward town. The Taylor home was crowded with anxious family members when they arrived. George Taylor, who had been among those ready to hang Nakohi days earlier, now stepped aside wordlessly to allow the Apache access to the small bedroom where his grandson lay. The child was indeed in a bad way. Skin burning with fever, breathing labored, small limbs twitching with delirium. Nakohi knelt beside the bed, his expression grave as he examined the boy without touching him. "How long?" he asked the child's mother. "Since midday," she whispered. "It came on so fast." Nakohi nodded, then opened his medicine bundle. From it, he selected several dried plants, some Sarah recognized from the hills surrounding her property, others unfamiliar. With practiced movements, he instructed Sarah to heat water while he crushed and mixed the herbs. "This will make steam," he explained to the family watching with desperate hope. "He must breathe it. Then a tea for drinking little by little, and this paste for his chest." Through the long night, Nakohi tended the child with a gentle authority that silenced any lingering doubts about his presence. He showed the boy's mother how to apply the paste, taught his grandmother the proper way to administer the bitter tea. Sarah assisted silently, handing him what he needed before he asked, her quiet confidence in his skills evident to all watching. As dawn lightened the sky, little Jimmy's fever broke at last. His breathing eased, his restless movements calmed, and he fell into a natural, healing sleep. The transformation seemed miraculous to the exhausted family. "He will be weak for some days," Nakohi told them. But the danger has passed. Mrs. Taylor, who had not left her grandson's side all night, reached for Nakohi's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. George Taylor stood in the doorway, his earlier hostility replaced by the humbled gratitude of a man who has been proven wrong in the most meaningful way possible. "We're in your debt," he said gruffly. "Anything you need, anything at all, you just ask." As Sarah and Nakohi walked home through the awakening town, word of the night's events was already spreading from house to house. The Apache had saved George Taylor's grandson. The savage was a healer. The widow Mason had been right all along. By the time they reached Sarah's gate, the morning sun illuminating their weary faces, they both understood that something fundamental had shifted in redemption, and in themselves. Winter settled over redemption with a gentle persistence, dusting the surrounding hills with snow that melted by midday but returned each night, a little deeper each time. The change in season was matched by a gradual shift in the town's relationship with the inhabitants of the small house at its edge. It began with small gestures. Mrs. Taylor arrived one morning with a basket of fresh-baked bread and preserves. "For your family," she said to Sarah, the word family encompassing Nakohi without hesitation. Harold Parson, shamed by his wife's exposed deception, cleared Sarah's debt at the store without discussion. When she arrived to make a purchase, he weighed her goods generously, adding an extra scoop of flour or sugar with mumbled comments about winter stores. The most significant change came from the children. Young Jimmy Taylor, recovered from his fever, spoke with awe about the Indian medicine man who had saved him. His friends, initially skeptical, became curious. One brave boy ventured to Sarah's property with a splinter deeply embedded in his palm, hoping the Apache might remove it with the same gentle skill he had shown with Jimmy. Nakohi obliged, using a sterilized needle and such deft movements that the boy hardly felt the extraction. Word spread among the children, and soon a small delegation would appear regularly at the gate, watching wide-eyed as Nakohi worked in the yard or garden. "Could you teach us to make a bow?" one boy finally asked. "A small one, just for practice?" Sarah watched from the porch as Nakohi considered the request, his usual reserve softening slightly. "Tomorrow," he said, "bring straight branches, willows from the creek." By spring, a remarkable transformation had occurred. The plot behind Sarah's house had been expanded into a proper garden, with neat rows marked for planting. Nakohi worked the soil with methodical care, while Abby followed behind, dropping seeds into the freshly turned earth. Sarah, nearby, prepared seedlings in small pots to be transplanted when the danger of frost had passed. "The beans go here," Nakohi instructed Abby, 3 finger widths apart. Abby nodded seriously, taking her planting responsibilities with the gravity of a child included in adult work. "And the squash at the edges, like you showed me." "Good," he approved. "They will grow together, helping each other." Sarah smiled at the exchange, recognizing the deeper teaching in his simple gardening instructions. The Apache way of planting beans, corn, and squash together mirrored their own unlikely household, different elements supporting each other's growth. The sound of approaching footsteps made them all look up. Frank Wilson stood at the garden's edge, hat in hand, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "Sarah," he greeted with a nod. Nakohi. The use of the Apache's name, rather than the Indian, marked its own small victory. "Frank," Sarah acknowledged. "What brings you by?" "Well, I've got some trouble with my well pump. Can't seem to fix it right." He glanced at Nakohi. "Heard you're good with such things." Nakohi wiped his hands on a cloth, studying Frank's face. After a moment, he nodded. "I will look." "Appreciate it," Frank said, his relief evident. "My Anna said to invite you all for supper after, if you're willing." The invitation hung in the air, its significance not lost on any of them. It was one thing for the town to accept Nakohi's presence or even seek his help, It was another entirely to welcome him into their homes as an equal. Sarah looked to Nakohi, letting the decision be his. "We will come," he said simply. As the men walked toward town, Sarah turned back to the garden, a strange tightness in her throat. Abby, less constrained by adult reserve, expressed what they all felt. "We're not so alone anymore, are we, Mama?" Sarah pulled her daughter close, kissing the top of her head. "No, sweet girl, I don't believe we are." The weeks that followed brought more changes. Children who had once been forbidden from playing with Abby now sought her out, fascinated by her friendship with Nakohi and the Apache words she had learned. Their mothers, initially wary, began to exchange pleasantries with Sarah at church or in the store. Reverend Collins, perhaps the most surprising convert, invited Nakohi to speak to the congregation about traditional Apache healing plants. A gift from the Creator, the Reverend called such knowledge, shared through our brother here. When summer arrived in full glory, the garden flourished, corn stalks reaching toward the sky, bean vines spiraling around them, squash leaves spreading protectively across the ground below. The three plants growing together, each contributing to the other's success, stood as a living metaphor for the household that tended them. Family, Abby had called them one evening with the straightforward certainty of childhood. Neither Sarah nor Nakohi had contradicted her. 1 year had passed since the day a small child approached a solitary Apache by the town well. The seasons had completed their cycle, autumn to winter, winter to spring, spring to the full bloom of summer, and now back to the golden haze of early fall. In that time, redemption had changed, and so had the three souls who dwelled in the small house with the blue door at the end of Cottonwood Lane. The annual Harvest Festival brought the community together in the town square, tables laden with the bounty of their collective labor. Sarah's bread had won first prize, displayed proudly beside jars of her preserves. Nearby, a collection of small wooden figures, horses, rabbits, bears, attracted admiring attention, each one carved with the distinctive style that the town now recognized as Nakohi's. "Mama, look!" Abby called, running toward Sarah with a blue ribbon clutched in her hand. "Miss Wilson says my penmanship is the best in school." Sarah embraced her daughter, noting how she had grown taller over the year, how her face had lost some of its baby roundness. "I'm so proud of you, sweet girl." Abby beamed, then darted away to show her ribbon to Nakohi, who stood at the edge of the gathering, more comfortable than he once had been among the townspeople but still maintaining a certain reserve. He accepted the ribbon with grave appreciation, speaking a few words that made Abby nod solemnly before skipping off to join her friends. "That child worships the ground he walks on," observed Mrs. Wilson, coming to stand beside Sarah. "And he's just as devoted to her." Sarah nodded, watching as Nakohi carefully folded Abby's ribbon and tucked it into his shirt pocket, near his medicine pouch. "They've healed each other, I think." "All three of you have," Mrs. Wilson said kindly. "You smile now, Sarah. For a long time after Thomas, I wondered if you ever would again." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion at the far end of the square drew their attention. A wagon had arrived, a stranger at its reins. Not entirely a stranger, though, the traveling photographer who visited Redemption each autumn to capture images of the town and its inhabitants for a fee. "Photographs," announced Mayor Collins, formerly Reverend Collins, until the town had elected him to civic leadership the previous spring. "Mr. Rutherford has graciously offered to take a special rate for family portraits today, in honor of our harvest celebration." A line quickly formed, families arranging themselves in their Sunday best, holding still for the camera's lengthy exposure. Sarah watched with interest but made no move to join them. Such luxuries had always seemed beyond her means, and besides, who would want a portrait of? "We should have one taken," Abby declared, suddenly appearing at her side. "The three of us." Sarah hesitated. "Abby, I'm not sure." "Please, Mama," Abby persisted, "so we can remember always." Nakohi had approached, listening to the exchange. His eyes met Sarah's, a question in their depths. Something shifted in Sarah's heart as she looked from Nakohi to Abby and back again. They had been through so much together: suspicion, accusation, rejection, and finally acceptance. A year ago, the idea of standing publicly as a family would have been unthinkable. Now, yes, she decided, we should. They waited their turn, an unlikely trio, the widow in her best dress, the Apache in a clean shirt with his hair tied back neatly, and the child between them, practically vibrating with excitement. When they stepped before the camera, a brief murmur rippled through the watching townspeople, but it held more curiosity than judgment. "Stand closer together," instructed the photographer. "The gentleman should put his hand on the lady's shoulder." Nakohi hesitated, looking to Sarah for permission. She nodded slightly, and his hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. The warmth of it spread through her like sunlight. "Now remain absolutely still," the photographer cautioned, disappearing beneath his black cloth. In that suspended moment, as they held themselves motionless for the camera, Sarah felt the weight of the past year. All its fears and struggles and unexpected joys crystallized into something profound. This captured image would show what they had become. Not just three individuals who happened to share a home, but a family forged through adversity and bound by choice rather than blood. The photographer emerged. Excellent. A fine family portrait. No one, not even Harold Parson, who stood nearby with his wife, contradicted him. Later, as the festival wound down and they walked home in the gathering dusk, Abby skipping ahead with the last of her boundless energy, Nakohi spoke quietly. "1 year," he said, "since the child asked if I wanted to meet her mother." Sarah smiled, remembering the fear and uncertainty of that first evening. "Did you ever imagine it would lead to this?" Nakohi shook his head. "The path of life has many turns we cannot see ahead." Ahead of them, silhouetted against the sunset, Abby turned and called, "Hurry up! I'm hungry." Sarah laughed, the sound free and light on the evening air. "We're coming," she called back. Then, more softly, to Nakohi, "We're home." As they continued down the familiar road, the distance between them closed naturally, their shoulders nearly touching, their steps falling into the same rhythm. Behind them, the town of Redemption faded into dusk. Before them, a small blue door waited, no longer a symbol of Sarah's isolation, but the entrance to the place where all three of them belonged.